In this lesson, you will learn to solve fractional equations. Here we have x over 3 plus 2 equals 1 over 6. And you are told to solve this equation for x. Now, yes, you could go through the traditional process of subtracting the 2 and then multiplying by 3, but it's better if you can just get rid of the fractions at the beginning, because no one really cares for fractions too much. So we want to get rid of the fractions by multiplying by the least common denominator. So we see a 3 and a 6. The least common denominator of 3 and 6 would be a 6. So what I want to do is I want to multiply everything by that 6. So I take 6 times x plus 3 plus 6 times the 2 equals, and then 6 times 1, 6. So when I multiply 6 times x over 3, remember 6 is the same thing as 6 over 1. So the 6 divided by 3 will cancel. I have a 2 over 1. And then 6 times 1, 6 would give me just 1, right? Because 6 over 1 times 1 over 6, the 6's would cancel, and I have 1 over 1. So what I have is 2x plus 12 equals 1, which is much easier to solve than with all the fractions. So I can now just subtract the 12 over to get 2x equals negative 11, and then divide both sides by 2. We now have x equals negative 11 over 2. Let me show you one more example. Here we now have x squared over 2 equals 2x over 15 plus 1 over 10. So once again, we would like to get rid of the fractions. And to do that, we need to multiply everything by the least common denominator. So we look at the 2, the 15, and the 10, and see what is the least common denominator. Now you could break apart 15, you get a 3 times 5, 10 we get 2 times 5, and here's a 2. We see which factors do we have the most of. So the 2's, this one has the most 2's, 3's, this one has the most 3's, and the 5's, this one, I guess it's a tie for the 5's, this one has the most 5's. So we have a 2, a 3, and a 5, which multiply together to give me 30. So what I want to do is multiply now everything by 30. So 30 times x squared over 2, 30 times 2x over 15, and 30 times 1 over 10. So now from here, the 30 divided by the 2 would cancel. I now have 15. 30 over 15 would cancel. When I divide, I get 2. 30 divided by 10 gives me a 3. So now I have 15x squared equals 4x plus 3. So to solve for x from here, we have a quadratic equation, and it's a trinomial. What I want to do is set this equal to 0 first. So I subtract the 4x and the 3 over from both sides, and now I have 15x squared minus 4x minus 3 equals 0. And then to solve from here, I want to factor. But to factor, I need to figure out 15 times negative 3, and so that's negative 45. And then I determine, how do I get negative 45? Well, it could be a 1 times 45. It could be a 3 times 15. Or it could be a 5 times 9. And it could be positive 1, negative 45. And then it could also be negative 1, positive 45, negative 3, positive 15, or negative 5, positive 9. And the question is, which one adds up to give me the middle term of negative 4? Well, to get negative 4, what I need is the 5 and negative 9. So now instead of negative 4x, I replace that with a 5 and a negative 9. So now I have 15x squared, then plus 5x, minus 9x, minus 3. And then I factor by grouping. And by the way, this is equal to 0. Factor by grouping, so I can group this together, and then I'll group these together. But when I group the second one together, remember there's a negative sign, so I need to change this from a negative to a positive. So now I can factor out from each set of terms, and so this first parentheses, they have a 5 and an x in common, and in parentheses I'm left with a 3x and then plus 1. Over here, I can pull a 3 out, and I have a 3x plus 1 in parentheses. So now to factor by grouping, I see the 3x plus 1, And I can pull that out. And in parentheses, I'm left with the 5x and minus 3. So I have now factored this equation. And now I can use the zero product property, which says that when I have two numbers multiplied together and the product is 0, then one of these two numbers must be 0. So either 3x plus 1 equals 0, or 5x minus 3 equals 0. So solving the first one, I can subtract 1 from both sides. I get 3x equals negative 1. Then divide both sides by 3. I get x equals negative 1 over 3. Then over here, I can add 3. And then I get 5x equals 3. Divide both sides by 5. I now have x equals 3 over 5. So my solution would be x equals negative 1/3, or x equals a positive 3 over 5. And that is my solution, and that concludes the lesson for today. So we will see you next time. So for the first few examples, we were working with numbers in the denominator. Now we're going to start dealing with some variables in the denominator. So here we see variables. The next example we'll see polynomials, and we'll see that again for the third example as well, where it's a little more difficult. So here's still the same concept, where I want to multiply everything by the least common denominator. So looking at the t, 4t, and 4, what is the least common denominator of those three values? Well, we see the 4 can break down as a product of 2 times 2. And this 4 is also 2 times 2. So we see what factors we have represented. Well, we have 2's and t's. As far as the 2's go, it's a tie for the 2's. We take just either of them in this case. So we take both the 2's. And then the t's, which one has the most t's? Well, it's a tie again for the t's. So we just take one of them. So our least common denominator would be 2 times 2 times t, which would be 4t. So what we do is we multiply everything by 4t. So when I multiply the first fraction by 4t, the t would cancel with the t. I'm left with a 4 times 4. Second term, 4t would cancel completely with the 4t. And then the third term, over on the other side of the equal sign, the 4 can divide with the 4. So what I have is going to be a 4 times 4, which is 16, minus, and then this is going to be a 1, equals 3 times t. 16 minus 1 is 15, and then divide both sides by 3 to get t equals 15 over 3, which is 5. So now let's increase the difficulty a little bit, where we now have not just monomials in the denominator, but now we have binomials. But still the same process, where I would like to get rid of the fraction by multiplying by the least common denominator. So the least common denominator of x plus 2 and x minus 2, well, x plus 2 is one quantity, x minus 2 is another quantity. And we have 1 x plus 2, that one has the most, so we just take all of the x plus 2's. This one has the most x minus 2, so we take just one of them, and we have x plus 2 times x minus 2 as your least common denominator. So we multiply everything by x plus 2 times x minus 2, and that's what we see right here. So when I do that for the first part, x plus 2 would cancel with x plus 2, so now I have 2 times x minus 2. Over here, the x minus 2 would cancel with x minus 2 down here. So I now have x plus 2 times 1 on the right side. So I now have 2 times x minus 2 equals x plus 2 times 1, or just x plus 2. So then to solve, I want to distribute the 2, so 2 times x and 2 times negative 2, to get 2x minus 4. And then I want to get x's on the same side, so I subtract x over, and I now have x minus 4 equals 2. And then add 4 to both sides, we now have x equals 6. So my solution would be 6. And now for the most difficult type of problem that you'll see is one along these lines, where I have 1 over x minus 1 plus 1 over x plus 2 equals 3 over x squared plus x minus 2. And this one is difficult because you need to factor first, and then find the least common denominator, and then multiply everything by that least common denominator. So when I factor x squared plus x minus 2, I will have two things in parentheses, and it's going to be x and an x. And the negative 2, I need a 2 and a 1, and if 1 is positive, the 2 is positive, the 1 is negative, I'll then get a positive 1 back out when I add those together. So I can factor, and then from here, I need to find the least common denominator. So I have x minus 1s, and I have x plus 2s. And the question is, how many of each do we take? Well, this one only has 1 x minus 1, this one has 1, so we just take 1 x minus 1, and then we take just 1 x plus 2, because that's the most that any of them have. So our least common denominator would be x minus 1 times x plus 2. So I'm going to multiply everything by x minus 1 times x plus 2. So it looks like a mess, but things are going to cancel pretty quick. So the first part, the 1 over x minus 1, x minus 1s will cancel. Right here, x plus 2s will cancel. Right here, both x minus 1 and x plus 2 will cancel. So what I'm left with is x plus 2 times 1 plus x minus 1 times 1 equals 3. And then I just solve this. X plus x gives me a 2x. Then 2 minus 1 gives you a 1. So we have 2x plus 1 equals 3. And then to solve, I just subtract 1 to get 2x equals 2. And then divide both sides by 2. And we get x equals 1. So that is my solution. And that concludes our lesson for today. So we will see you next time.